You might find it hard to stomach the fact that, long before the headlines and the funeral tributes, Chaka Khan had already tried to defy every grudge and every bitter comparison to reach out and save Whitney Houston. She stepped over ego, over rivalry, over pride. And yet, every time she came close, someone or something pushed her away. So what, or what kind of force, kept her at a distance? And what terrible secret is buried behind the way Whitney's life ended? Tonight, we reopen a file that has sat in the dark for decades and trace a horrific truth that has been whispered about but never fully faced. The strange bond between Whitney Houston and Chaka Khan didn't begin like a friendship. It began like an omen. From the very first moment their paths crossed, it was as if an invisible thread quietly tied them to the same fate, one steeped in glory, but also in ruin. The story starts in the biting winter of 1980 in New York City. Outside, the avenue glowed with neon signs and traffic lights, but nothing could compete with the magnetic pull of Carnegie Hall, where a different kind of brightness awaited inside. That night, the auditorium was overflowing, the seats filled with people leaning forward, waiting for one name: Chaka Khan. Behind the curtain, half hidden by thick velvet folds, a 7-year-old girl stood quietly, almost blending into the shadows. Whitney Houston was there only as a background singer for her mother. No one glanced at her twice. No one imagined that this slim teenager, clutching her nerves in silence, would one day stand as the most formidable rival to the very star everyone was there to adore. Then Chaka appeared, and the room detonated. Her hair was a wild, voluminous halo of curls, her metallic dress caught every ray of light, and her voice sliced through the air like fire. When Sweet Thing began, the audience rose, dancing, shouting, losing themselves as the spotlight clung to one woman and one woman only. It was an image of power and pleasure, a blinding electric beam that swallowed everything else on stage. Whitney didn't move. She stood frozen, her eyes wide, absorbing every breath, every note. In that instant, she felt both awe and a creeping dread. This was the path to glory, yes, but it was also a narrow road that ran straight toward an abyss. Because behind the sequins and stage lights, everyone in that world knew Chaka was drowning in alcohol, cocaine, and chaotic love affairs. After the show, as Chaka walked off stage with a cigarette still burning between her fingers, her gaze drifted for a second and locked with Whitney's. Just a passing moment. A few seconds at most. But for Whitney, it burned into her memory like a scar. Who could have guessed that this fleeting glance in a crowded backstage hallway would begin an obsessive, tangled connection that would stretch on for 3 decades? Outside in the lobby, small clusters of people were already talking about the show. They mentioned the young girl with that crystal-clear voice who had backed up her mother. Some shrugged and said, "She's good, but she's no Chaka." Tenser, others lowered their voices and said, "Give it time. In a few years, she'll replace this entire generation." Those casual comparisons were the first sparks. For Whitney, they became a quiet fuel. For Chaka, they were the first warning flares on the horizon. And that warning didn't have to wait long for an answer. Just 2 years later, that invisible thread pulled them together again, this time not on a grand stage, but inside a smoky studio. On the 14th of June, 1982, at Electric Lady Studios in Greenwich Village, Whitney slipped into the room as just another name on a list of backup singers for a modest project. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke and the sting of cheap whiskey. Guitar riffs and drum fills cut through the haze as musicians tuned up and joked. Whitney sat off to the side, quietly watching, not yet the center of anything. Then the studio door opened, and Chaka Khan walked in. Her eyes were lined with exhaustion from too many late nights, but her presence was still a storm that bent the room toward her. Among veteran artists and well-worn session musicians, her arrival shifted the atmosphere instantly. Conversations stopped, heads turned. And then, at a routine moment, a simple test vocal from the young girl in the corner. The noise drained from the room. Whitney opened her mouth to sing, and her fresh, bright voice flowed out with a confidence that didn't match her age. That was the first time Chaka truly heard Whitney Houston, not from a distance on a shared bill, but up close, with nowhere for the sound to hide. After the session, the musicians buzzed among themselves in low, excited tones. On one side, they said, was the established, raw, gritty diva whose voice carried years of pain and rebellion. On the other, a new, untouched tone, smooth but powerful, with the potential to swallow the older generation whole. From that moment, the connecting thread between them stopped being just coincidence. It began to look like destiny. Just 2 months later, on the 22nd of August 1982, the industry caught its first clear glimpse of the two women side by side. At an after-recording party in Manhattan, under dim lights and over loud music, Chaka and Whitney stepped into the same frame. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, a seasoned star already known for drugs, scandalous relationships, and headlines that read like warnings. On the other, a 9-year-old girl whose eyes still held a softness, still used to standing behind her mother, not in front of the crowd. Yet it was precisely that contrast that glued them together in the minds of those watching. According to a Billboard piece from the 10th of September 1982, insiders had begun whispering about Whitney Houston, a young singer from New Jersey who had caught the attention of veteran Chaka Khan. That note, buried in the pages of a trade magazine, quietly announced a shift that would soon become impossible to deny. In December 1982, during another long night at Electric Lady, a scene unfolded that felt almost prophetic. Whitney sat in her usual corner, notebook in hand, carefully jotting down details. Chaka arrived hours late, hair disheveled, her steps just a little unsteady. When the producers finally convinced them to try a harmony part together, the difference between them became almost unsettling. Whitney's voice rang out, clear and sharp, soaring on pitch without effort. Chaka's tone was hoarse, rough-edged, soaked with experience and bad habits. But when those two voices met, something chilling happened. They blended into a sound that stunned the room, a strange, beautiful collision of two eras. It was like hearing two generations argue and agree at the same time. From those cramped, smoky studios, rumors filtered out into the wider world. People began to speak of a peculiar bond. Chaka as the elder sister, Whitney as the heir. One star at her peak, another just beginning to blaze into view. Guess what was waiting around the corner? For a few years, the picture seemed deceptively calm. Chaka and Whitney shared studios, smoke, jokes, and late-night laughter. On the surface, it looked like they were simply two artists passing each other in the corridors of fame. But a quiet shift was already underway. On the 14th of February 1985, Whitney Houston released her self-titled debut album. At first, it sounded like a risky experiment. Could this young voice from New Jersey really carve out a place in a world already packed with soul and pop titans? But month after month, her tender ballads slipped into every radio rotation, every bar jukebox, every record store display. By October 1985, Saving All My Love for You had climbed all the way to #1 on the Billboard charts. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just a promising newcomer. This was a phenomenon. For the first time, the industry understood that the ground beneath their feet was moving. Whitney's image, white dress, gentle smile, angelic tone was everywhere at once. Rolling Stone hailed her as the new voice of America. The photos were soft, polished, immaculate, carefully curated to feel both pure and profitable. The machine had found its perfect face. Ebony described her as a fledgling bird, finally breaking free of her mother's shadow. Who could have imagined that in the span of a single year, Whitney Houston would become the youngest diva to stand shoulder to shoulder with the veterans who had dominated the stage for decades? Chaka Khan, meanwhile, continued to score her own victories. Her 1984 album I Feel For You kept her name in the conversation, and the title track even earned her a Grammy for Best R&B Vocal Performance. But the impact of Chaka's success, though real, didn't shake the earth the way Whitney's rise did. It was in that quiet imbalance that a new kind of unease began to sprout. On the 25th of February 1986, at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, the 28th Annual Grammy Awards turned that unease into something undeniable. The hall was packed, cameras flashing in every direction. When Whitney Houston's name was called for Best Female Pop Vocal Performance for Saving All My Love for You, the whole room surged to its feet. The roar of applause seemed endless. Whitney walked to the podium glowing, sparkling like a star that had just pierced the edge of the sky. But somewhere in another row, Chaka sat almost completely still. To the audience, she was smiling, clapping along like everyone else. But according to those who watched her closely, there was a clouding in her eyes, a darkness quietly settling in. When the show ended, the whispers rolled in from every corner. The press dubbed Whitney the perfect successor in the Black Diva lineage. Critics wrote that she carried the soul of gospel, but wore it in a clean, commercial pop shell. It was something, they hinted, that Chaka Khan, with her rebellious image and stormy reputation, had never been allowed to represent. People began to pit them against each other with simple, brutal labels. One was now spoken of as the glorious past, the other, the blinding future. That comparison cut both ways. So let's ask the question. When the world celebrates the youth rising to the top, what happens inside the one who paved the road first? When the name Whitney Houston is spoken in the same breath as Chaka Khan's successor, is that truly a compliment, or is it a premature obituary for Chaka's reign? In April 1986, Billboard ran a stark line. Whitney Houston, they said, had reclaimed the Soul Crown, but with a cleaner, more marketable formula. On the surface, it sounded harmless. Just another industry observation. Hidden underneath, it was a blade. The era of rebellious funk, raw and unpredictable, was being quietly declared over. The age of polished pop soul had officially begun. And who had once embodied that wild, rebellious funk more than anyone? Chaka Khan. Then, in July 1986, Ebony published a commentary that shook insiders. According to that piece, Whitney Houston might represent the end of the previous generation. Those cold words landed like a hammer, closing the lid on a coffin, sealing an era that Chaka had once ruled. Backstage at events around that time, witnesses later recalled that Whitney still greeted Chaka with the same politeness, the same careful smile, but the air between them had changed. The hugs they shared in front of cameras no longer carried warmth. They felt staged, like a ritual performed for the public rather than a genuine embrace. Whitney, by most accounts, didn't fully realize what was happening. She was swept up in tours, chart positions, and interviews. But Chaka felt it with painful clarity. Her place in the spotlight was being overshadowed day by day. From this point on, everything turned into a long, slow slide. Tiny cracks in their relationship became distance. That distance hardened into a wall. The sisterhood, once admired by fans and journalists alike, began to fracture in ways people could feel, but not yet name. From 1985 to 1986, Whitney Houston rocketed into superstardom that few artists ever reach, while Chaka Khan, for the first time, felt herself slipping into the background of a story she had helped write. It wasn't just a simple changing of the guard. It was the beginning of a silent war, a confrontation no one publicly admitted, but everyone could see. In the shadows of that period, the seeds of jealousy, frustration, and helplessness took root. And those seeds would later explode into a tragedy that no one, not even Chaka, could stop. Whitney Houston's ascent to the very top of the music world happened almost too quickly for anyone to process. After the Grammy storm of 1986, it felt as if the whole planet had quietly agreed on one thing. She wasn't just a great singer, she was the voice of a generation. Hit after hit, multi-platinum records, sold-out tours stretching from New York all the way to Tokyo, every step she took seemed to confirm the myth. In the glittering haze of the late 1980 seconds, Whitney Houston was America's angel. But behind those dazzling spotlights, something darker began to slide in from the edges. People like to say, when the light is at its brightest, the shadow is at its deepest. For Whitney, that shadow had a name, Bobby Brown. They met when Whitney had already become a global star, while Bobby was the rebellious ex-member of New Edition, young, defiant, and unpredictable. On paper, their worlds should never have collided. But when they did, it was like fire meeting gasoline. They were drawn to each other in a way that felt fated, dangerous, and unstoppable. From that moment, the carefully crafted angelic image that Clive Davis and the label had built around Whitney began to show its first cracks. At first, the press treated their relationship like a thrilling love story of opposites: the good girl and the bad boy, the saint and the troublemaker. Magazine covers sold well, headlines were playful, but as time passed, the tone shifted. Bobby Brown began taking Whitney to parties that stretched until morning rooms where bottles never stopped pouring and lines of cocaine were laid out openly on gleaming glass tables. When paparazzi photos surfaced, showing Whitney slumped in the back of a limousine, eyes bloodshot, expression vacant, the rumors that had once been dismissed suddenly felt inescapable. This was no longer gossip. It was something you could see. Ironically, just as Whitney started to spin downward, Chaka Khan was trying to claw her way back from the same abyss. The older star, who had nearly lost her career in the 1,970 seconds to heroin and alcohol, was now fighting to reinvent herself. Chaka walked away from the endless parties, entered rehab, and tried to rebuild a life piece by piece. While Whitney was slipping deeper into the night, Chaka was dragging herself back into the daylight. That cruel contrast made their story even more bitter. One woman was descending into the hole Chaka knew all too well. The other was trying to climb out of it with bleeding hands. Then came a summer night in 1,989 inches, Chicago, when the tragedy stopped being just an idea and became a scene you could picture. It was a lavish party by the river, the kind of event where money seemed to hang in the air. Neon lights reflected off the water. The room was thick with cigarette smoke, and disco music shook the walls. Whitney Houston appeared in her usual armor, a glittering dress, a radiant smile, a star's posture. But her eyes told a different story, tired, unfocused, dim. Her voice was a little too loud, her words just a bit slurred. On a nearby table, half-empty liquor bottles were scattered among lines of white powder. The guests were laughing, shouting, dancing like there was no tomorrow. In one corner, though, Whitney's body language betrayed her. She trembled, laughed harder than the joke required, and then, without warning, slumped forward like a puppet whose strings had been cut. At that exact moment, Chaka Khan walked in. She had been invited to meet some producers, to talk work, not to walk into a distorted replay of her own past. But what she saw was chilling. A young diva on the verge of self-destruction, bathed in the same blurry party lights that had nearly destroyed Chaka a decade earlier. Without hesitating, Chaka rushed to Whitney's side, grabbed her, and pulled her out into the hallway. Out there, the sound changed. No more pounding bass, no more screaming guests, just ragged, uneven breathing. Sweat beaded on Whitney's forehead. The smell of drugs mixed with expensive perfume and alcohol clung to the air. In that hallway, Chaka was no longer a jealous rival or a wounded elder. She was a survivor, a woman who had already died once inside addiction and somehow clawed her way back. Now, she saw her younger self staring back at her through Whitney's glassy eyes. But fate did not allow that rescue to last. Within moments, Whitney's friends spilled into the hallway, their voices light, their movements careless. They pulled her from Chaka's arms, laughing off the incident as just another wild night, and dragged her back into the neon-soaked room. The music swallowed her again. Chaka stood alone in the dark corridor, frozen. The red light from the party doorway cast a harsh glow across her face, catching the sweat and the anger and the fear. In that instant, she knew she had just touched a fracture in Whitney's life, a crack that might never be sealed again. That night in Chicago would later be remembered like a prophecy. After that moment, Whitney's downward slide barely paused. The press started catching more and more of the damage. There were stories of canceled shows blamed on exhaustion, public arguments with Bobby Brown, and a slowly eroding public image that had once seemed untouchable. For Chaka, the worst part was not watching the public tear down the perfect angel they had once worshipped. It was recognizing every step of Whitney's collapse as a path she herself had walked before. Only this time, there was no one in the wings strong enough to pull Whitney back. The irony grew sharper as the 1,990 seconds began. On the surface, Whitney's star only got brighter. In 1992, The Bodyguard turned I Will Always Love You into something more than a hit. It became a global phenomenon. The single reportedly sold over 20 million copies worldwide. Whitney wasn't just a black star anymore. She was the pop icon of the entire planet. On screen, she was the soft, gentle leading lady, the love interest every audience rooted for. Off-screen, she became for a time the wealthiest black woman in entertainment. While the world was hypnotized by that fairy tale, the darkness behind the curtain thickened. Bobby Brown, the man Whitney had chosen, brought with him a life filled with addiction, volatility, and endless scandal. Tabloids plastered their covers with photos of the couple shouting on sidewalks, being escorted out of clubs, or stumbling through crowds. Whitney's once bright eyes looked increasingly hollow. Her smile grew strained. And yet, people still clung to the fantasy. They believed that voice was invincible. They believed that angels don't fall. Until one summer night in July 1995, in Miami, when the myth collapsed in real time, the American Airlines Arena was packed. Over 15,000 fans filling every seat, tickets sold out weeks beforehand. After rumors of her absences and cancellations, this show was supposed to be her triumphant return. The stage design was grand, bathed in blue light. As the intro music began, anticipation rippled through the crowd. Whitney appeared in a sleek, form-fitting white dress, stepping into the spotlight with that familiar, dazzling smile. The opening number was, "I Have Nothing." But almost immediately, something was wrong. From the first notes, her voice trembled. High notes that had once soared effortlessly now wavered and fell flat. Her breathing was off, shallow and strained. The audience, expecting perfection, went quiet, then tried to lift her with applause. Whitney pushed on, moving into greatest love of all. But her eyes were distant, unfocused. After only a handful of songs according to those present, she abruptly turned and rushed off stage. Her image froze on the big screen as she disappeared from view, leaving thousands of fans in anxious confusion. Backstage, things were far from the polished calm the public imagined. Whitney collapsed. Her skin was slick with sweat, her face pale, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Tech crew members shouted for a doctor. Staff members scrambled for water, towels, anything that might help. The hallway that usually echoed with jokes and last-minute instructions now buzzed with panic. It was in the middle of this chaos that Chaka Khan appeared again. Chaka was in Miami that day. Not on tour, but because, as friends later said, she had a bad feeling about Whitney. Some claimed she decided at the last minute to fly in and see for herself how Whitney was really doing. When word raced through the building that Whitney had collapsed backstage, Chaka ran toward the restricted area, heart thudding. She tried to push through, her voice rising, but two large bodyguards blocked her path like a closed door made of muscle and stone. In front of her, there was no backstage glamour, just a barrier that would not move. Chaka shouted, demanding to be let through, insisting she needed to see Whitney. According to people who were there, she didn't care about how she looked, didn't care if anyone thought she was out of control. She wanted in. But the answer was a cold, flat refusal. She wasn't needed. Some witnesses later claimed that Bobby Brown himself was nearby and subtly signaled to the guards not to let Chaka pass. They believed he wanted Whitney to remain dependent on him and feared any outside influence that might pull her away. Chaka, who had come hoping to be a lifeline, found herself pushed to the edge instead. Furious and desperate, she reportedly lunged forward and almost struck one of the guards. The tension in that narrow corridor was suffocating. Technicians and staff rushed in to separate them before the confrontation exploded further. Chaka's voice broke as she cried out, "She's dying in there, and all you care about is her image." But all she received in return were indifferent stares and rigid, unmoving shoulders. Inside the guarded room, Whitney was being calmed with a sedative administered by a private doctor. Her condition, at least for the moment, stabilized. But they didn't call an ambulance. They didn't rush her to a hospital, where records and witnesses would create a trail. According to people within the camp, the fear wasn't for Whitney's life, it was for her reputation. The show had been sold out. The star had to remain flawless in the public eye. Better to risk her health, even her life, than to let a picture of her on a stretcher leak to the press. Chaka was eventually escorted away from the backstage hallway, tears streaking down her face. Later that night, she found herself standing alone in the parking lot, staring up at the arena roof. The blue stage lights still pulsed in the dark, and music thumped faintly through the concrete as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Inside, the show business machine kept turning. Outside, Chaka stood in silence, knowing she had hit another invisible wall. The next day, mainstream media kept the story neat and sanitized. Reports simply stated that Whitney Houston had been exhausted from a demanding schedule. No mention of a collapse, no mention of panic backstage. No mention of Chaka Khan's presence or her attempt to get through the door. Officially, it was a minor incident, barely worth a headline. But inside the industry, the real story raced from mouth to mouth. People whispered that Whitney had taken a dangerous combination of substances before the show. They said Chaka Khan had tried to intervene and been shut out. They said management had decided to bury the truth rather than risk the brand. To the public, Whitney kept touring, kept releasing music. But the way people looked at her had changed. They started asking the question no one wanted to say out loud. Was the angel falling? For Chaka Khan, that night in Miami was more than a disaster. It was an answer. In Chicago in 1989, she had grabbed Whitney by the shoulders and felt a brief, fragile chance to pull her back. In Miami in 1995, she learned that chance was gone. There were forces around Whitney family, Bobby Brown, managers, executives that formed a wall she could no longer breach. After that night, whatever remained of their sisterly bond was, in practice, over. Publicly, the two women still crossed paths. The world remembers Whitney's 1992 re-recording of I'm Every Woman, originally Chaka's song, where Chaka provided background vocals. On camera, it played like a passing of the torch, a joyful collaboration between two queens. But in Chaka's heart, according to those close to her, she knew the door had quietly been locked. Whitney no longer truly trusted her, and the people who controlled Whitney's world would never allow Chaka near that inner circle again. The night in Miami never took up more than a line or two in official biographies. In the sanitized version, it was just a moment of fatigue, a diva overwhelmed by a heavy workload. But for those who stood in that hallway, it was a live prophecy playing out in real time. A superstar crumpled behind a door, an older survivor screaming to help and being shoved away, a deliberate choice to shield a reputation rather than protect a life. When a hand reached out to save her, Whitney didn't grasp it, or perhaps was prevented from doing so. And in the end, she would be the one to pay the highest price. As the new millennium dawned, Whitney Houston no longer resembled the angel in the white dress who had ruled the 1,980 seconds. The glow was still there on stage, at least from a distance. But up close the mask had begun to slip. What happened in Miami in 1995 hadn't been an isolated moment, it was a warning. And from the year 2000 onward, the tragedy stopped hiding in the shadows. It erupted into plain sight, brutal and undeniable for the entire world to watch. On the 7th of December 2000, airport authorities in Hawaii detained Whitney Houston when marijuana was discovered in her luggage. The news traveled across the globe in hours. It wasn't a whisper behind closed doors. It wasn't a vague excuse of fatigue or stress. For the first time, the public was forced to confront the truth they had tried to ignore. The angel was falling, and the descent was real. Instead of recovering, Whitney seemed to spiral further. Concerts were canceled at the last minute, sometimes with little explanation beyond health issues. Each new public appearance shocked fans more than the last. Her once flawless face appeared drawn and hollow. Her legendary voice shook and cracked. Her eyes, once bright and alive, often looked lost, vacant. Magazine headlines turned colder, crueler, leaning on phrases like fall from grace, as if her life were nothing more than a plot twist. Bobby Brown, instead of being a lifeline, appeared to drag her deeper into chaos. According to many reports, their marriage was riddled with violence, addiction, and explosive arguments. They were often portrayed as one of the most infamous black couples in Hollywood, chased from bars, followed out of nightclubs, occasionally intercepted by the police. Cameras were always nearby. If the 1,980 seconds had played like a carefully polished fairy tale, the 2000s unfolded, more like a raw, unscripted play, exposing every fracture, every bruise, every scream. In the summer of 2005, Bravo aired a reality show called Being Bobby Brown. On paper, it was meant to be his comeback, a peek into his life, a chance to reframe his narrative. In reality, it became something else entirely. A tragic spectacle that stripped away what little privacy Whitney still had. Viewers were stunned to see the woman who had once embodied elegance and control now captured in footage where she screamed, rambled, and slurred her words, clearly under the influence in several moments. Many longtime fans admitted they couldn't even finish certain episodes. One particular scene lodged itself in the public's mind like a shard of glass. Whitney and Bobby sat together in a bathroom, while Bobby graphically described dealing with a grotesque, intimate bodily issue involving his wife. Whitney laughed uncontrollably, detached from the humiliation, her reactions dazed and disoriented. That scene, aired in July 2005, became a gruesome symbol of how far she had fallen. It didn't just chip away at her image, it shattered it. People asked themselves a painful question: how had the voice behind "I Will Always Love You" been reduced to this? The show was eventually canceled, but the damage was permanent. The stain on her legacy could not be wiped away by a press release or a photo shoot. From that point forward, Whitney was no longer treated as an untouchable legend. She became a living exhibit of what fame, drugs, and domestic turmoil could do to a human being. Her life turned into a cautionary tale, replayed in slow motion on cable television. During those years, Chaka Khan all but disappeared from the mainstream conversation surrounding Whitney. She wasn't on the reality show, she wasn't in the tabloid photos, and her name rarely appeared in the loudest headlines. Yet inside the industry, those who knew her said she watched Being Bobby Brown with a kind of agonized recognition. For Chaka, Whitney was no longer just a younger artist or a lost friend. She was a reflection, a mirror held up to Chaka's own past, except this time the whole world had front-row seats. According to one close source, when Chaka tried to watch the first episode, she turned off the television halfway through and broke down in tears. She didn't need to see more. The signs were all there. The erratic behavior, the fragile body language, the nervous laughter covering up something much darker. Miami in 1995 had shown her she could not reach Whitney anymore. The 2000s proved that even the public, once protective and adoring, had begun to turn away, choosing fascination over compassion. On the 14th of September 2001, Whitney appeared at a memorial event honoring the victims of 9/11. When she stepped in front of the cameras, people had to look twice. She was so thin that some barely recognized her. The loose, baggy clothing she wore couldn't hide how much weight she had lost. Photographs of that day spread rapidly through newspapers and magazines. Fans didn't argue over vocal technique or chart positions anymore. They worried that they were looking at a woman disappearing in plain sight. Then, in September 2006, Whitney officially filed for divorce from Bobby Brown. On paper, it looked like a possible turning point, a chance to break free. But by then, a decade of addiction, chaos, and public humiliation had done its damage. The golden voice that had once stunned the world was now a fragile shadow of what it had been. Throughout the 2000s, older fans sometimes described her with a chilling phrase: a voice that had died, but a body that kept going. A fellow singer who had worked with her once put it bluntly: when Whitney entered a room, they said, the aura that used to arrive before her was gone. What lingered instead was the smell of cigarettes, alcohol, and disappointment. It was as if the light had been switched off and only the smoke remained. In a few rare interviews from that era, Chaka Khan was asked about Whitney. She didn't rant, she didn't accuse. She simply said quietly, "I tried, but some souls can't be saved." It sounded less like a judgment and more like a confession from someone who had reached out, been shoved aside, and now had to live with the knowledge that her warnings had gone unheard. If the 1,980 seconds were the years of pure light, and the 1,990 seconds were the period when hairline cracks began to appear beneath the shine, then the 2000s were the years of open collapse. Whitney's breakdown was no longer edited out, no longer hidden behind stage curtains and carefully worded PR statements. She was crushed out in the open, under the relentless gaze of cameras, her pain transformed into content, her ruin turned into a show for the world to watch. Who could have imagined that the same angel who once made the entire world hold its breath with "I Will Always Love You" would close out her decade with bathroom scenes on reality TV, collapses on stage, and disheveled tabloid photographs? Those weren't just scandals. They were warning lights, signs that an ending was slowly, relentlessly approaching. On the 11th of February 2012, Los Angeles shimmered under the glow of Grammy weekend. Limousines lined the streets, red carpets were rolled out, and the city hummed with excitement for music's biggest celebration. But at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, something else had slipped quietly into the building. While photographers were testing their flashes and sound crews were checking their levels, death was already moving toward the 4th floor. No one knew that within a few hours, one of the greatest voices in history would take her last breath in almost complete silence. All around the city, people were getting ready for the parties, the televised performances, the glitz, but up on that 4th floor, Whitney Houston had become almost unrecognizable, even to those who loved her. It was said that she had once lived like a queen, yet at 48, she now looked less like royalty and more like a lost spirit drifting through the corridors of a life that no longer fit. The day before, photographers had captured images that instantly unnerved the public. Her hair was disheveled, her dress strap slipped down her shoulder, her pale face slick with sweat. She had pushed her way into a rehearsal, her movements agitated, her voice and eyes frantic. One witness was heard whispering, "That's not Whitney anymore." At the time, it was just a stunned comment. Looking back, it sounded like a prediction. The next morning, a hotel server arrived at room 434 with a tray of food. When the door cracked open, the scene inside was bleak. A bathrobe lay crumpled on the floor. The heavy smell of alcohol and cigarettes clung to the air. Empty pill bottles were scattered across a table next to a drained bottle of champagne. Whitney appeared briefly, trying to smile, but the expression on her face was thin, icy, more like a quiet announcement of doom than a greeting. The door closed again. No one in the hallway knew they had just seen Whitney Houston alive for the last time. As the afternoon went on, music began to pour through the door of 434. Melancholy gospel songs played loudly, mixing with sudden bursts of laughter and fragments of sobbing. Some people later said it sounded like a cry for help. Others dismissed it as just another drug-fueled episode, the kind that had become disturbingly routine. Either way, no one stopped the music to check. In that luxurious hotel, nearly everyone was focused on fittings, rehearsals, guest lists. Whitney's voice, once the main event, had become nothing more than an echo leaking from behind a locked door. Around 3 p.m., according to reports, a bodyguard heard a strange noise coming from the bathroom. When the door was finally forced open, steam filled the room, curling up from a hot tub that had gone from comforting to deadly. Whitney Houston lay face down in the water, her body motionless. Her hair was matted, her skin had turned a frightening shade of blue. On the floor, pill bottles and liquor containers were scattered like the pieces of a crime scene no jury would ever see. A scream ripped through the room, but in the thick walls of the hotel, it was swallowed almost immediately by silence. Rumor had it that envelopes of cash quietly changed hands that day, slipped to certain employees in exchange for their discretion. No cameras, no leaks, no raw images of what that bathroom truly looked like. Whether those stories were fully accurate or not, what remained was undeniable, a terrifying emptiness where a life used to be. And so the questions began. Why didn't anyone reach her in time? Why hadn't someone stopped this long before the water in that tub turned still? The cruelest twist of all lay just one floor below. While Whitney's body lay in that bathroom, Clive Davis's pre-Grammy party reportedly continued as planned. Glasses clinked, the music boomed, applause erupted again and again. Upstairs, an angel had fallen. Downstairs, the industry danced on. That contrast cut into fans like a blade. The idea that the biggest party in music might continue while one of its brightest stars lay lifeless above them felt less like an accident and more like a verdict. In this business, the message seemed clear. The show doesn't stop for a soul, not even for the soul of Whitney Houston. From Carnegie Hall in 1980 to Electric Lady Studios in 1982, from that Chicago party in 1989 to the backstage chaos in Miami in 1995, every milestone, every warning sign, quietly funneled into this single point. Room 434 at the Beverly Hilton. The closed door of that room didn't just mark the end of a diva's life, it swung open a floodgate of painful, unanswered questions. Why was Whitney alone in those final hours? Why had she not been taken to rehab when there was still a chance to turn the story around? Why did the celebration downstairs continue, almost untouched, as if her death were nothing more than an inconvenient scheduling glitch on Grammy weekend? When Chaka Khan heard the news, she reportedly broke down. She knew instantly that the battle she had been silently fighting for years was over and she had lost. In Chicago, she had grabbed Whitney's trembling body and tried to pull her out of the party's grip, only to have friends drag Whitney back inside. In Miami, she had screamed in a hallway, trying to push past security, only to be shoved away. At the Beverly Hilton, there wasn't even an opportunity for a final attempt. This time, the door closed before she ever got close. History repeated itself, but now the ending was permanent. There would be no second chance, no comeback arc. The coroner's report would later present the facts in stripped-down language. Drowning, with cocaine and sedatives present in her system. But for many who had watched her decline, that sentence felt like the thinnest possible version of the truth. Technically accurate, but emotionally incomplete. Because Whitney Houston, they believed, did not die only from addiction. She died from neglect, from being overlooked and overworked, from the shadowy hands that had squeezed every last drop of profit from her voice, and then, when her body finally gave out, quietly stepped back into the dark. And the most shocking part came not from the bathroom at the Beverly Hilton, but from what happened in the days immediately after. Just hours after her body was taken out of room 434, something eerie unfolded on the outside. The music charts lit up again. Whitney Houston's album surged back into heavy rotation. Singles, box sets, DVDs, everything with her name on it suddenly became inescapable. In the week that followed, her sales reportedly climbed to heights that even she had never reached while she was alive. Her voice was everywhere, but she was gone. Who could have predicted that her death would trigger such a massive commercial wave? Record labels rushed to reissue old albums and package definitive collections. Television networks prepared special segments and retrospective marathons. Movie channels replayed The Bodyguard over and over, turning the film into a kind of memorial and marketing tool at the same time. While fans mourned, sobbing in front of their screens and blasting her songs in their cars and living rooms, millions of dollars quietly flowed upward into the bank accounts of executives and companies that had long profited from her name. Posters, T-shirts, commemorative CDs. Whitney's image was suddenly everywhere again, pressed onto glossy paper and stamped onto merchandise. Her death didn't just end her story. It turned her into a brand, polished and repackaged for a new era of consumption. Her family was pulled almost immediately into a whirlwind of legal and financial maneuvering. Questions arose with brutal speed. Who would control Whitney's estate? Who would manage her catalog and image rights? Who had the authority to approve documentaries, biopics, and posthumous releases? Behind public statements of grief, there were contracts being drafted, negotiations being held, signatures being exchanged. Different relatives made different comments to the press, sometimes contradicting one another. The media captured fragments of a bigger picture: confusion, conflict, and a scramble over what she had left behind. There were tears, yes. Houston family members cried at the funeral, visibly shattered in front of cameras. Dionne Warwick gave interviews, speaking about Whitney's legacy and pain. Whitney's daughter, Bobby Christina, sat near her mother's coffin, staring in a way that seemed to belong more to someone in a trance than a teenager. But behind the sorrow that the public saw, there also appeared to be something colder. Questions about control, about rights, about the future cash flow linked to Whitney's legacy. The music industry did not stand back and watch. Just days after her death, executives from major labels reportedly held closed-door meetings. The agenda, according to insiders, centered on how best to honor Whitney's memory while managing her catalog, how to position greatest hits collections, whether to release demo tracks, how to time anniversary editions. Every unreleased recording, every unfinished session, suddenly took on a new glow. What had once been scraps on a shelf were now precious assets. A very private catastrophe had quietly transformed into a commercial goldmine. As old hits climbed back up the charts and tribute performances filled award shows, one chilling truth seemed to hover over everything. The more the world grieved, the more money her name generated. And yet, the central question remained untouched. Why did she have to die like that? Some people insisted it was nothing more than a tragic accident, a woman with a long history of addiction, drinking, using drugs, and then slipping and drowning in a bathtub. But those who had been close to Whitney spoke in whispers that hinted at a darker narrative. They mentioned what they described as an odd delay in calling for help. They claimed that Whitney had wanted to return to rehab more than once, only to be dissuaded or blocked by people around her who feared the impact on her schedule or image. They spoke of unfamiliar faces going in and out of the hotel in the days leading up to her death. And they never forgot the brutal symbolism of the still glittering party downstairs. To some, it felt like an unspoken rule. The party must go on, no matter who pays the price. Chaka Khan, the woman who had tried to pull Whitney out of the fire more than once, would later sum it up with a devastating line. She said that Whitney didn't have to die, but there were hands that wouldn't let her get close, and there were hands that chose silence at the exact moment when Whitney needed them to act. That kind of statement was more than grief. It sounded like an accusation aimed not just at individuals, but at an entire system. When Whitney Houston was laid to rest in Newark, New Jersey, the city where she had been born, thousands of people filled the streets. Fans stood shoulder to shoulder, singing, "I Will Always Love You," through their tears. They held up photos of her in her prime, arms raised, eyes closed, microphone in hand. Some had grown up with her music, others had discovered her late. All of them felt that something irreplaceable had been taken from them. But even as the casket was lowered and the church echoed with prayers and sobs, a darker question gnawed at many minds. Were they simply burying a legendary singer? Or were they witnessing the final step in a process that had been unfolding for years, maybe even planned in ways no one would ever fully see? So now the file closes, at least officially. The reports are written, the cause of death is logged, the tributes have been aired, and the records reissued. But the questions still linger like smoke. Was Whitney Houston a victim of her own choices alone? Or was she slowly pushed toward an edge by an industry and a circle of people who valued the image more than the woman? And what about Chaka Khan, the elder star, who saw the danger long before the world did, who tried to pull Whitney out in Chicago, who tried to reach her in Miami, only to be blocked, dismissed, and finally shut out entirely? With a little more time, a little more access, could she have saved Whitney? Or was every attempt doomed from the start, scripted to fail by forces stronger than love, stronger than friendship, stronger than one woman's will to help another? In the end, you have to ask yourself, was this just a tragic story of addiction and bad decisions, or the carefully managed downfall of a woman whose death turned out to be almost as profitable as her life? What do you think? With just a little more luck, could Chaka Khan have pulled Whitney back from the edge? Or was the ending already written long before Room 434 went quiet? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden stories, the buried secrets, and the dark files behind Black Hollywood's brightest stars, don't forget to